So let's turn to Revelation chapter 6. I gotta tell you, one of the hardest, this is hard to study anyways, but one of the hardest things that I've had to think through is how to walk through it. Because everything we're about to look at is a detail that's a part of a bigger thing. And so I'm going to do what it seems best to me, and so be gracious with me if it's not. But it's difficult to know the best way to go through this so that it all makes sense together. So what I decided we should do first, before we get to the details of it, is take a sweeping view of the 7 seals and what happens when they're opened. We're just going to walk through real quick. So that covers chapter 6, chapter 7, and then chapter 8, verse 1. So it's actually 2 chapters in a verse that we're look through them and see what's there. Because do you remember the last time we wrapped up? My proposition to you is that chapters 4 and 5 make up cycle 1 of the Revelation. It tells the story, the big picture story, of creation to the great new creation consummation, real quick. And not really much detail at all. It just starts off with God being worshipped as the Creator. It shows us the Lamb who was slain, worthy to take the scrolls. He and the one on the throne are worshipped. And it ends with all of creation, every creature in creation, worshipping them. And as we said last time, how does that make sense unless it's the end of the story? Because we have no indication anywhere that all of creation will worship God and then revert back to wickedness or something like that. So that's how I understand it so far. So what that means is that chapters 6 and 7 plus 8:1, I'm just going to throw that in there. As I understand it, this represents cycle 2. This is the second telling. And it's not the whole story, it doesn't start at creation, but it is the second telling of the story of the vision, and it does take us to the consummation of everything. That's what we're going to see at the end, I think. It takes us to the very end of the new creation reality. Then we're going to see the story pick up again, a third time, and we'll get there. So first, as you look at chapter 6, you probably have headings in your Bible, right? Mm-hmm. What is the heading, if you have one, what does the heading at chapter 6 say?
The seals.
The seals.
Mine has opening the 7 seals.
Okay.
Mine says the Lamb breaks the first 6 seals.
Okay, so the seals, right? They're the theme.
Mine's
Now,
chapter 6 next
oh, you got one of those. A purist Bible. In Revelation 8, verse 6, do you have another heading there?
The Lamb breaks the 7th seal.
Yeah.
At verse 6?
Mm-hmm. No, 8.
The trumpets.
At chapter, yeah, there you go. So chapter 8, verse 6, we see trumpets.
Oh.
So what we see
yes.
is seals, and there are 7 of them. And then the next set of things that we see are trumpets. There are 7 of those. And that's in chapter 8, verse 6. And then as you keep going, you go to chapter 16, and what do you see there?
The 7 rules of God's wrath.
So, as a big picture thing in Revelation, I just wanted to point out, there are 3 sets of 7s that indicate God unleashing things in some way upon the people of the earth. Seals, trumpets, and bowls. Now, if you read this as a straight-through story being told, the whole Revelation is just a straight-through story being told, what we're going to see when we get there is there's a lot of repetition in these. And actually, it doesn't compute that these could happen multiple times. For instance, as we're going to see, as the seals are being opened, the stars are falling out of the sky, the mountains and the islands are being pushed out of their place, the sun and the moon go wacky. I mean, everything in creation is just out of sorts, you know. So if that happens again, that's a little suspicious. Well, how did the stars get back up there? How are they falling again? So that's one of the signs that there's a retelling going on, but maybe differently told each time. So I just wanted to point out, there's series of 7s. We're going to be looking at that first series of the seals. Okay, so back to chapter 6. What we are looking at now is what happened in chapter 5. We're rewinding. The Lamb took up the scroll in his hand with 7 seals on it. But this time we're not going to now focus on the worship that he receives because of that. We're going to focus on the actual opening. Like, John, remember, what was John's reaction when no one could be found who could open it?
He cried.
Oh no! This is terrible! Oh my gosh! I mean, this is like, he was forlorn. This is awful. Why? Because the prophet who sees the vision of God and his counsel is expecting to receive some understanding of what God's about to do. This is supposed to lead to a decision, to some action on God's part. Because what's happening on earth needs to be dealt with. That's the whole prophetic pattern we saw in the Old Testament. So, all the way through chapter 5, I have no doubt that John is happy that there's someone with a scroll and he knows who it is. And I have no doubt that he's happy to be there to witness all the worship that's going on. But there's still something not quite satisfied, which is, great, someone's got the scroll. And, right? Someone's got it, but nothing's really happened with it yet. So now that we get to chapter 6, there's something I think that is ultimately satisfying for the prophet as well as for the audience to say, oh, here we go. We weren't begrudging the worship. We were all into the worship. Yes, worship him, worship the Lamb, worship the one on the throne. But in the back of our minds, there's the question, but what about the scroll? Right? Now, here we go. Let's look. So, the Lamb, now that we're focusing back on that scroll, chapter 6, verse 1. Yeah, let's read. Let's read the whole chapter here. Somebody wanted to read all or part of it for us?
I'll read.
All right, sweet. If we'll read through 17, the whole chapter.
Sure. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come!" I looked, and there before me was a white horse, and its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. When the Lamb opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come!" Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come!" I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. When the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come!" I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" Then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed just as they had been. I watched as he opened the 6th seal. Earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to the earth as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it?"
Oh my goodness. Oh. So, how many seals have we seen opened up by now?
6.
So there's 1 left. Scroll can't really be opened yet. But so far, 6 out of the 7 have been opened. So let's catalog these. Seal number 1. The horse that comes when called is white, right?
Yes.
And I'm just going to summarize by saying this represents conquest, because it says the rider holding a bow came out conquering and to conquer, bent on conquest. That's his mission, is to conquer. The second seal is opened, and the horse that comes out is fiery red. And how would we summarize his effect, the writer's effect? Violence
War.
and war. Does that sound right?
Yes.
So people are slaying each other, killing each other. So over here we have a bow, over here we have a large sword. Okay, the third seal is opened, and we see a black horse come out, and the rider is holding what?
Scale. Pair of
And-
scale.
Yeah, what comes out is that there's a famine going on. There's a shortage of food. That's why it's so expensive. We're putting some pieces together. I hope you don't mind there. But the fact that there are scales, which speaks of the marketplace, and then confirmed by the fact they're talking about how much food costs, speaks of a famine, a rarity of food, so that it costs way more than it should. The fourth seal is opened, and a pale or a green, depends on your translation. The word is actually green, but a pale green horse, ashen, like the color of a dead body. That's yeah, sorry, but that's.
Green, I have black. Black and blue is if made by bruising.
Okay, yeah. So
I guess it kind of gets green.
Yeah, right.
Mine says pale
Right.
green like
There
a
you go.
corpse.
Like a yeah. So they're bringing the implications into the translation. If you were to just translate this straight up, you'd say green, but there's implications that the translators have a hard time knowing how much to put into the translation. Just so you know, that word green is what's used for grass. I mean, it's actually green. In the book of Revelation, it's used of grass. But okay, so now the rider of the pale green horse is
Dead.
oh gosh. Now it doesn't say he's holding anything, but he's dead. So that's pretty clear. Now he's unlike the other riders because he has a companion coming close behind. Who's close behind?
Hades.
Hades, okay. Now when the fifth seal is opened, I'm just going to say the altar souls to summarize that part. And then when the sixth seal is opened, okay, there's a whole lot that goes on. So what are we going to say? I'm going to say
Everything collapses.
nature, yeah, nature in upheaval. Does that sound fair?
Mine says cosmic disturbances.
I'll take
Mine
that.
says a great earthquake.
Well, just to summarize it all,
Yeah.
cosmic just sounds good too. Nature and upheaval is my summary for that, but also it's the human response to it, right? Okay, so that's our summary, real quick, of chapter 6. The 6 seals that are opened. Now, as you look into chapter 7, just to keep our big overview going, in the midst of all this, this is a pretty devastating thing for John to behold. This is awful, right? In chapter 7, look at verse 1. He says, "After this I saw." Now, one of the things we're going to have to work through individually and as a group is when John says, "After this I saw," does that mean that what he sees next is next in chronological order, or is it just the next thing he saw? Because remember, this vision is not meant to be a movie he's watching. It's actually snippet. It's a vision, and so there's bang, this thing happens, and then I saw this, boom, and this happened, then I saw this, boom, this happened. So we have to try to work through in our minds, where do I understand this next thing fits into actual chronology? And I don't want to, get too deep into that mud, but I just want to let you know, as you read through this, don't necessarily assume, and then this is what happens next in Earth's story. What he actually says is, and then I saw. Right? So just keep that in mind. The vision is a vision. It's not necessarily a chronological story being told. So, with that said, what do we see? Let's just read it because it's better than my trying to summarize it for you. Is someone willing to read chapter 7? Same number of verses. Interesting. Do we? All right.
After this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on the land, or on the sea, or on any tree. Then I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God. He called out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm the land and the sea, "Do not harm the land and the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God." Then I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. From the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. From the tribe of Reuben, 12,000. From the tribe of Gad, 12,000.
Just to save you the time, you can just say the name of the tribe, because...
Okay. From the tribe of Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." All the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the 4 living creatures. They fell down on their faces before the throne and worshipped God, saying, "Amen. Praise and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength be to our God forever and ever. Amen." Oops, I'm on page 2.
I can say amen to that too.
Then one of the elders asked me, "These in white robes, who are they and where did they come from?" I answered, "Sir, you know." And he said, "These are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes."
And so let me read chapter 8, verse 1. "When he," meaning the Lamb, "opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour." Weird. Now, wow, what an ending to the seals. So, we're not going to try to cover all this tonight, obviously. I just wanted you to see the big picture flow of it. Because what we're going to try to do as we go through is see if the cycle thing makes sense, and if it does, what pattern do we find in the cycle? So here's what I'm going to see. In the second cycle that we're looking at now, we have God's judgment. That's what the seals seem to indicate, the first 4 seals indicate. Also, the 5th seal, with the souls under the altar, also speaks to that, doesn't it? How long until you avenge our blood? So that speaks to judgment, even though judgment hasn't really been shown there. You get to the 6th seal, and there's definitely judgment there, wouldn't you say? People are hiding, saying the great day of his wrath has come, and who can withstand it? So judgment. When you get to chapter 7, what do you see? You see a picture of the righteous. The sealed of God. Now, it's pictured in 2 different ways. You've got the 144,000. Mysterious. We're going to have an interesting time trying to figure that one out. But also, you have the picture of those who are before the throne. And that, by the way, I can't wait to get there, because as much weirdness and questionable stuff happens up to verse 9 of chapter 7, once we get there, we can start to really let it soothe our battered minds as we've gone through all of this hard stuff, the really scary stuff. Once we get to 7:9, we're going to find a vision of God's promises to his people being kept. And that's where I think the cycles are always meant to lead us. God judges the wicked, which is a part of his promise, by the way. We get a picture of the righteous ones, And then we see how God keeps his promises to those righteous ones. And I really look forward to getting, especially to the end of chapter 7, because what it shows is that all through the Old Testament, God was giving hints of what the ultimate benefit would be to his faithful ones. And here, we're not at the end of the Revelation yet, and we're already getting a sense, oh, it's worth it. Oh, I can't wait to get there. It's so lovely. And then when you get to chapter 8, verse 1, you have what seems to me the end of everything. Not the end of the universe, but the end of the action. Why this silence in heaven? And remember, this is the capital city of God. This is where the decisions of the great emperor of the universe, that's where the decisions are made, and where his servants go out from him to the earth or wherever they're going. For there to be silence in the capital city, to me speaks of, it's done now. Not everything that's ever going to be done, but this is done. And so that speaks to me of the end of the cycle. Then we're going to pick up and see how the cycle rewinds and starts over again. But as I'm reading this, I see it comes to the final ending. We're just like, there's more details. You got to give me more details, John. He's like, the vision will give you more details later. Just enjoy the end of the cycle as we see it. We'll get more details as we go. So speaking of more details, let's dive back into these. Really hard to, for us as readers it may not be as hard, but I think for John, as the one receiving the vision, seeing and hearing things that we aren't, because we're just taking his descriptions, I think this has been incredibly difficult for him to see it unfold. Number one, it would be scary. I mean, all of this is new. This is not something John has seen before, so the whole thing, I think, is pretty intimidating. But especially when you realize what he's seen, this would be pretty hard for him. So I think the vision is laid out the way it is, partly for John's sake. I think if he were to have 18 chapters of intense ba-boom, 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 monsters and rah, I think he would stop. I think I don't know this, but I'm thinking part of the reason that the vision has the cyclical nature is partly for the guy receiving the vision. He can take a breather. He can just be filled with oh, good. And then, boom, okay, he got his breath. He got his rest. So the same is going for us as readers. I'm sure that you would agree, after you go through these really hard seals being opened and you see the terrible wrath that God's unleashing on the world, it does you good to take a second and breathe in his goodness, his promises, the worship. And then you're getting ready for the next round, the next cycle to come. Okay, so let's talk about the first seal being opened. Do you notice when the Lamb opens the seal, who speaks?
The creatures.
One of the creatures, right? What's up with that? He's the one with the authority to open the seal. You'd think he would be the one saying authoritatively, come! But it's one of the creatures. Which, I'm just going to mention this, it's not for sure, and I don't know this, but I have been wondering, because of their participation in the first 4 seals, I've been wondering whether they have seals on the scroll. If as a part of God's counsel, maybe 4 of those seals are the seals of the creatures. Like, we agree with this decision. We're behind this. I don't know, maybe. So anyways, as he peels open that first seal, one of the creatures, who are God's entourage, right?
Yeah.
They're the closest to the throne, except for the Lamb. They're the closest to the throne. We saw all the way to the Old Testament. They have been God's servants and God's entourage as far back as we know about. They're his chariot, basically. So they're his constant companions as far as we can tell. So they have this role to play. They speak on behalf of the authority of their king. And they call out with authority, come. Now, here's an interesting thing I learned. The word that we see in our English, come, is kind of vague because he could be speaking to John or to this horse and rider that come out. In fact, a lot of translations, the older ones especially, like King James, they say, come and see. Does anyone have a translation that says that? Yeah. Or come and behold. Now, if the creature is saying, "Come and behold," or "Come and see," to whom does it seem like he's speaking?
John.
John,
Yeah, the visionary. Come and see this. You got to get this too. That's in most translations you won't get the "and see" or "and behold" part. And I was looking at my Greek texts, because I try to see the original as best I can, and there's different Greek manuscripts. But I didn't see the "and see" in the Greek either. So it seems more likely that this is what was actually what John heard, just the word for come. But interestingly, the same word that means come in Greek can also mean go. It's cool. Weird, but cool. I was looking this up, the way this word in the Greek is used in the New Testament. Most of the time it's translated come. There are 3 or 4 times it's translated go. And how can you tell which one it is? You just read the context and figure out, is someone coming or going? Sometimes it's staying. So they came and stayed, or they went. So, the reason I think that's interesting, as I'm reading through what happens when the creature says the word, they seem like they're both in play. Come from wherever you are. I don't know where the white horse was before. John doesn't say, and he emerged from the clouds of heaven. We don't know. He just, after the word is spoken, the horse appears. But then the horse seems to go into the world to have the whatever effect. So the come or the go, either way works. Come out from where you are, but you need to be going to accomplish something, right? That's the whole point. This horse and rider are being sent to do something.
I have a question.
Yeah.
only because of the way, like mine has, that they broke the seal and it says, I heard of the 4 living creatures, heard one of the 4 living creatures call out, come, and I looked. So that would be John.
John, yes.
Okay.
And that would be where maybe the C doesn't need to do that, because right after it says it, he says, I saw it.
Right,
So
good.
it's kind of repetitive to
Yeah.
say, come and see, and then I looked and behold,
Yeah.
is what mine says.
So the only difference that makes is it kind of determines in your mind who's being called. Now, if I'm reading correctly, the horse or rider is being called, but others would see John being called. Okay. Either way, it happens,
I
but.
think he walked the horse and went right across that little stage.
Right? Beckoned, right?
Come, I looked up and saw a white horse. So I'm thinking he's looking up.
So it's coming from. Now, let me see. Do I have?
Mine doesn't say that.
I want to look this up real quick if I have it in front of me. This is verse 2, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm gonna check. I looked and behold a horse white. So the up doesn't appear there. So I think they added that in there to whatever they were going to flesh it out.
Using the, it's hard to tell because some of the verses does say, it mentions John in the first sentence of.
Are you talking about the first 4 seals?
Yeah, but
Okay.
like the first sentence, like 6:1. Now I saw and I heard one of the 4 living creatures. It mentions the lamb. It mentions the 4 creatures. It mentions but it doesn't mention the white horse or anything in that sentence.
Right.
So the come should be one of the people in the sentence.
I think come means he's talking to the horse, come, and then the horse comes out.
Like they're not there yet.
Right.
You know.
So someone who hasn't appeared yet is being beckoned to appear.
Come, and
Yeah.
then John says,
Yeah, that's how I read it.
But
either way,
confusing.
Either way could
Yeah.
be, honestly. So, but either way, the horse comes, right? What we know is that it's a white horse. Now, before we go much further, I wanted to make sure we understand this horse thing. which is, by the way, in pop culture, this is the most important part of Revelation for pop culture. Because the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse sounds so cool. And you can turn them into all kinds of creepy. I mean, and I've seen it done.
Yeah.
You just make them gross, okay? And they're scary, and they're going to bring the end of the world, so some teenagers are going to go save the world. That's how the pop culture
That's
is.
right.
But I want you to know that, first of all, they're not all buddies coming out together, okay? It's sequential. But secondly, this is rooted in Old Testament prophecy. Like most things in Revelation, as we're seeing, nothing really is unique here. This is taking what has already been seen by other prophets and bringing it all together into one vision. So to give you an idea of what I mean, let's go to the book of Zechariah, chapter 1. We've seen this before, but I just want to give you an idea of seeing horses and the colors of the horses being mentioned. This is a prophetic thing. This is what prophets do. That's what they see. Zechariah chapter 1. It's towards the end of your Old Testament. He's one of the prophets that is referred to as minor, which just means not long. It doesn't mean unimportant. So Haggai and then Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 1, verse 8. In Zechariah's vision, the whole vision, has a lot of similarities to John's vision in Revelation. So you find yourself flipping back a lot to it, right? So starting in chapter 1, verse 8. During the night I had a vision. And there before me was a man mounted on a red horse. He was standing among myrtle trees in a ravine. Behind him were red, brown, and white horses. So in this vision, what colors do we have?
Red, brown, and white.
Yeah, we have red, and then brown and white. Okay. Now he doesn't know what these are, so he's like, what are these? What am I seeing here? And then the man on the horse, who we find out is the angel of Yahweh, he says, they are the ones Yahweh has sent to go throughout the earth. Which again brings me back to the idea of come or go, I'm sending you. And they reported, the horses, or the riders of the horses, reported to the angel of Yahweh who was standing among the myrtle trees, we have gone throughout the earth and found the whole world at rest and in peace. We've seen this before, but they're like sent out to go check things out and report back. Just like in a human kingdom. Kings send out their messengers to see how things are in their kingdom, and they come back and get a report. Now, I'm going to read verse 12 just because this comes in for later. This doesn't really apply to what we're looking at in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2 in Revelation. But thinking about the 5th seal and those souls under the altar, stay here in Zechariah 1 with me. Look at verses 12 and 13. See if there isn't a bit of an overlap. Then the angel of Yahweh said, Yahweh Almighty, how long will you withhold mercy from Jerusalem and from the towns of Judah, which you have been angry with these 70 years? Someone crying out, how long? And then look what Yahweh does. So Yahweh spoke kind and comforting words to the angel who talked with me. It's not an exact parallel to the 5th seal, but it's interesting that someone's crying out to Yahweh, how long is this going to take? And Yahweh comforts them. There's no white robe, there's no wait until this, but it's interesting how that plays out here, just like in Revelation. Alright, so there's one more place I definitely wanted to show you where we see colored horses, but this time it's being pulled by horses. I just have to find out where to go. Where are you? Oh, it's in Zechariah 6. So stay in the same book. Go to chapter 6. Starting verse 1. Zechariah speaking this time, he's the visionary in this case. I looked up again, and there before me were 4 chariots coming out from between 2 mountains, mountains of bronze. Huh, that's crazy. The first chariot had red horses, the second black, the third white, and the fourth dappled. All of them powerful. So how do you compare the horse colors here to the Revelation horse colors? There's one difference.
Dappled.
Dappled instead of the deathly green.
Dappled gray.
Dappled gray, okay. So, interesting, the colors are mentioned, and they're very similar to the ones in John's vision. I asked the angel who was speaking to me, "What are these, my Lord?" That happens a lot, doesn't it? The visionaries seeing all this stuff, they're like, "What am I seeing?" The angel answered me, "These are the 4 spirits of heaven." Doesn't it remind you of the 7 spirits who are before the throne, sent out into all the earth? These are the 4 spirits of heaven going out from standing in the presence of the Lord of the whole world. The one with the black horses is going toward the north country, the one with the white horses toward the west, the one with the dappled horses toward the south. He didn't mention where the red one went, but if you had to guess a direction, where would you guess?
East.
Okay. There's only one left, right? What's that?
Unless I'm reading this wrong, black horses going forth into the north country, and the white ones are going forth after them. And then in parentheses it says, because there are 2 northern powers to overcome.
Wow, that's very different.
Yes, it is.
So this one says, black horses going toward the north, the one with the white horses toward the west.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if there's a... Actually, look, if you have a footnote at the bottom of your page, it does say an alternate way to translate it is, or horses after them. So, they're both possible translations.
See, and I have the dapples going south. So it doesn't say anything about what,
Right, that one, or east is left out.
or eastern.
In yours, west is left out, and this one it mentions west. Yeah. So, that's one of the interesting questions of translation. You get multiple options that work, unfortunately, and I'm glad that they at least put the other option down here. We can at least see that's possible. They put their preferred one in the text itself, but they at least gave us a heads up. Could be this. Look at verse 7. When the powerful horses went out, they were straining to go throughout the earth. And he said, now who's the he here?
The Lord.
Well, I'm guessing it's the angel, right?
Angel.
He's the only one physically there. He said, go throughout the earth. That reminds me of the living creature saying, come or go.
Mine says, and the Lord said, go and patrol the earth.
Really?
And mine has capital H for he.
Right. So, which translation is yours?
New Living Translation.
Yeah, New Living adds things in to help the reader keep up with things sometimes. So they add words in that aren't necessarily there.
Mine did too.
Now, the angel of Yahweh is, as you study who that is actually the presence of Yahweh himself. So it's different than like Gabriel. You wouldn't refer to Gabriel as doing something and Yahweh's doing it, because Gabriel's a separate entity. He's just a messenger for God. The angel of Yahweh, though, as you look at his record throughout the Old Testament, he's a being that is as if he's God's manifestation. A lot of people have concluded that he is the Jesus before fleshly Jesus.
Maybe that's why
Maybe.
he said Lord.
Yeah, I think they're just cutting out the middleman.
Okay.
That's helpful if you're just reading through it. I think it takes something away from the study of it, but it is helpful if you're just reading through it. But anyways, the angel says, go throughout the earth, and they went throughout the earth. Then he called to me, look, those going toward the north country have given my spirit rest in the land of the north. They accomplished something. These aren't just messengers. They're going out to do something. They're not just scouting to see how things are going. Okay. So anyways, all that to say, when we get to, you can go back to Revelation thing. When you get to Revelation chapter 6, when John sees this is a little familiar to him. Seeing a horse come out, and then seeing a second one, and the colors. So something familiar with this. But this is different than what Zechariah saw. Because they're not all going out together, And he doesn't just know their direction, he actually sees something about what they're doing, what their role seems to be. So look at verse 2. We see it's a white horse. What is the rider on the horse holding?
And a crown on his head.
Yeah, so there's two details we know, besides that his horse is white. The horse being white might have some symbolic meaning. It's kind of the white horse in our culture, so don't try to translate this to John's culture. But in our culture, when you talk about a knight on a white horse, what does that speak of?
He's a good guy.
Right? Yeah, he's the hero of the story. Don't try to import that here. The white horse seems to speak to what we see the rest of it say, which is conquest, going out to fight. This point is often brought up when we read about Jesus going into Jerusalem on what? Donkey. That would have been a king's way of saying ahead of time, I come in peace, when if he were to be coming on a horse, maybe even more so on a white horse, that would communicate something very different, which is, I'm here to take you down, do you surrender? That would have been the message. So the idea that Jesus came into Jerusalem on a donkey would speak to his coming in peace rather than on a charger of war, which he does do in Revelation 19. He shows up on a white horse. So I'm not going to right now get into who this is, or might be, or is understood to be. But I will throw this out there. As you listen to and read the commentaries on this, you're going to see a lot of ideas about who this is and why it's a white horse and all that. Some say Jesus. Some say the Antichrist. Some say the church in the first century taking the gospel to the whole Roman world. Some say no one in particular, just conquest in general. We're not going to do that just yet. I want to get a sweeping feel of what the whole series is saying, and if you want, we can go back and try to parse through all that. But I think we'll get caught in the weeds if we try to stop and figure out everything about these things. So let's just see what John saw, without trying too much of that yet. So what he sees is conquest represented, right? White horse. By the way, it says he wore a crown, and that word crown, I just always have to point this out because our English doesn't help us too much on this. It's not the crown of royalty, it's the crown of victory. The same crown we've been hearing about all through Revelation. The Stephanos, the wreath. So victory, conquest, that matches, right? The bow, just so you know, the bow is something all through the Old Testament, and I looked this up just to get my own bearings on this. The bow is a very Old Testament way to talk about conquest. And I have scriptures here if you'd like them. I brought it up just so I could show you. I'll give you a few examples. In Isaiah 13, 17, and 18, God is talking about bringing the Medes, who's like the Persian kingdom, to conquer the Babylon. And it says that their bows were striking people down mercilessly and indiscriminately. Children, old people, their bows was the focus of it. Because that is the conquest weapon of choice in a lot of these prophecies. In Jeremiah 6, 22 and 23, he summoned an army and they're all holding bows and spears. There's not a lot of sword talk in a lot of these. It's the bow. Jeremiah 50, 14 to 16, those coming against Babylon are called to use their bows to bring Babylon down. So there's more, but the bow language really fits the Old Testament model of conquest, coming in to wipe out another kingdom. So all of the pieces fit for conquest, and then John actually tells us he goes out conquering, and with the purpose to conquer. That's why the repetition is there. He is conquering, and that's his whole purpose, is to conquer, right? It's not just happening as he goes, oh look, I'm winning. That's what he's there to do. He's a conqueror. So, again, let's not try to, squeeze out of that all that it could mean for modern day or past or whatever. Let's just look at it for what it is. What John saw was that when the first seal was opened, conqueror, conquest, was the first issue that came. Okay? Now, when the second seal is opened, the Lamb opens it because he's the only one worthy still. Another creature speaks. And we don't know, it says the second, it says another one, but we don't know if it's the same order he gave us before. Some commentators tried to do that. try to say, oh, so this was the lion, because that was the one you mentioned second before, so this must be the, I don't know about that. Another one spoke, that's all we really know. And he says the same thing, come, and this time what kind of horse appears?
Fiery red.
Okay. And what's the effect this time? Conquest was a little vague, so, it's clean, conquered, nice, okay? Hope it's a good conqueror, hope everything works out. When you get to the second one, you can't ignore what conquest requires. The second one gives us some details of what the conquest might look like. So it's fiery red horse. Let me use an appropriate marker here. What do we know about the rider?
There's a mighty sword.
All right. Yours says mighty. What? I'm trying to think.
Mine says large.
Large, yeah. Which I think that's an implication of. But the word actually is large sword. And here's what's interesting about this. The sword, we talked about this before when we talked about the sword coming out of Jesus' mouth in chapter 1. The sword that we saw coming out of Jesus' mouth in chapter 1, I was mentioning, that's the two-handed whoosh sword, alright? That's the hack-on sword, the big one. This is the smaller version that's, used for jabbing. It's not like the big Conan the Barbarian sword. This is the one that you might use one-handed and you do this with it. But what's interesting, he uses the smaller sword, but he mentions it's a big one. Okay, I don't know what to make of that, but this is a person who is very obviously fit for war, and if the bow signifies conquering, like on the big scale of conquest, this might speak to the more personal, violent side, because this is where you get into the fight and it's close combat like this. Bow is not so good in close combat. Unless you're an elf in the Lord of the Rings, then you can do that. But usually, real battle, if you're close combat, you put your bow down and you pick up a sword, right? So what does all this represent? What is he sent, or what effect does he have when he goes?
Peace from the earth.
Bloodshed.
So it was given to him, it says. It doesn't say what it was given to him, except it was given to him to take peace from the earth. Like that's his job. That's what he's been given to do by God. To take peace from the earth. Does he kill people?
People kill each other.
Interesting.
No.
Almost like, and we don't want to stretch this too far, we don't want to force this too much, because this is a vision after all. But there's something about this writer's effect on the world that suddenly violence is becoming more in quantity, and it seems in quality as well. Violence is just erupting on the earth because of this, right? What's that?
Just no peace.
Yeah.
Constant.
Now, one thing I'm thinking of is the first century Christians, when they read this, or having this read to them, because there's only one copy for the whole group, right? When they're hearing this read to them, when they hear the word peace, the peace was taken from what?
The earth.
The earth, right? Not from households, not from whatever. We're talking about a large-scale peace. Has it ever been that the earth was full of peace?
No.
Totally.
Before the fall.
Yeah, good. That was about the last time. Right before that crunch, or that squish. So we're not talking about everything was harmonious and then this guy shows up and people are yelling at each other in their kitchen. That's not it. We're talking about wide-scale peace. So what I was thinking about is in the first century, when they received these messages from John, they were in the Roman Empire. Have you heard of the Pax Romana? That's Latin, so it doesn't help doesn't help an English speaker. But what this means is the Roman peace. So Pax is peace. Now the reason this is significant is there was a little over 200 years where Rome accomplished something pretty significant. By conquering so much of the known world and having such a strong, heavy hand, they really took away a lot of the warring, a lot of the tribal violence between peoples, because now they're all united under the banner of Rome, and if you tried to start trouble, what would happen? You done. Ask Jerusalem. They caused trouble for Rome, Rome annihilated them. That's what happens. when you cause trouble, the way that Rome accomplished peace was through violence. But their violence was so effective that no one wanted, well, I shouldn't say no one, few people were willing to give it a shot. So they accomplished a large-scale peace. Now, of course, you look at the lives of Jesus and the apostles, was there peace everywhere? Ooh, no, certainly not for Christians. That's the whole point of this book, isn't it? There's not peace for the Christians. But we're talking about the large-scale world peace, the world that they knew at the time. That wouldn't last forever. The barbarians came in, eventually the empire started falling apart. But it held for, a good 200-ish years under the Roman Caesars. That's what it made me wonder. When it says it took peace from the earth, it made me wonder if they're talking about a large-scale peace was taken off the earth. Now that's the ancient world, that's how probably they would have heard it. If this indeed applies for today, just so you know, the world today knows more peace than probably the world has ever known. Which sounds like a strange thing to say, because there is warfare going on, and it's brutal. It's awful. But when you look at the large-scale picture, how much warfare really goes on? It makes big news when there is, except it lasts so long we kind of forget about it. But when war breaks out, it's a big deal, because it's not common in the world anymore. So if this were to happen today, and we're not going to try to decide that tonight, but if this were, a possibility for today, what this might mean is the general peace between nations was removed, rather than, oh look, husband and wives get more mad at each other now, or something. That already happens, okay? It's already the way things are. Kids and parents are already having issues with each other. Political parties, am I right? Okay, so we're not killing each other, thank God. But we already know there's unrest. We already know there's a lack of peace. But this is something totally different. This is a big scale lack of peace. All right, so that's the second one. So we have conquest. Doesn't it make sense that the next stage of conquest, after you see conquest, you would see the violence that's involved?
Yeah.
Right? What comes after the violence of what's involved in conquest?
Famine.
So the third seal is broken. A third living creature says, "Come," or "Go." And what's the color of the horse this time?
Black.
Now, just like we would think of the white horse as being the good guy, we often associate the black horse as being the bad guy, Lord of the Rings. And that's not the point. This isn't good or bad. In the ancient mind, black spoke of maybe physical sickness. It spoke of distress. This is not a moral thing, it's just a condition of life thing. So black indicated something distressing. And as someone, I think Dewey just said, we've got famine here. Now, the scales are one clue that we're talking about famine, because we're talking about marketplace scales, not how much do I weigh scales, right? But the two scales like this to see if I'm getting a fair deal. Is that really a pound of wheat, right? So, in the book of Proverbs, do you remember it says that the Lord detests dishonest scales? Why? Because if you go into the market selling food to poor people and you're charging them $1 per pound, but you've fixed your scales so that it's actually 2 pounds when they only got 1 pound of food, they're paying double what they should. And the Lord hates that. How dare you take advantage of people who need to eat so that you can line your pockets, you monster, That's the idea. So the scales is the marketplace where you're going to sell the food. What food is mentioned?
Wheat, barley,
What else?
olive oil, and wine.
Now, who speaks when somebody says, how much this costs and don't touch this? Who is it that's speaking?
The being, living creature.
Well, the language is actually a little more vague. What does it say?
It says,
Oh,
voice
yes.
among the 4 living creatures.
Okay, so here's the question. Does it mean
Oh, yeah.
one of those creatures said it, or does it mean the one in the middle of them, the throne or the lamb? The one on the throne or the lamb?
Oh,
We don't know. It's a heavenly authoritative voice, that much we do know. But the language shift makes it sound like it's not the same creature speaking now that said, "Come." It sounds like maybe God himself or the lamb who's opening the seals. Makes sense that if it's him to me, because he's the one opening the seals. He declares the price problem, which is interesting. Okay, so the olive oil and the wine. This is probably way more detail oriented than we need to be to get the point here. But I was interested, I was curious to see how much does wheat and barley actually cost for us today. And we don't really sell wheat the way they did back then because we have so much processing that goes on. So I found various products of wheat that are the not totally processed kind of thing. So I found all the way from 50 cents a pound all the way to $2.50 a pound. I'll just use that range, okay. How much was it said to cost for wheat in this scenario?
A day's pay.
Day's pay. Now the actual word is denarius, but that's a day's pay, so I'm glad the English just puts that in there. let's cut out the middleman, we don't have to go look at a website. What is a denarius? A denarius was the average worker's day's wage. Now, people in this room have quite a variety of days' wage, so I'm not gonna, ask each person. But let's just say you make $15 an hour, and you work 8 hours a day. What's a day's wage in that case? $120. Now this is for 2 pounds of wheat, am I remembering right?
It says quart
Okay.
on mine.
2 pounds.
Mine was a loaf, or 3 loaves of
Mine says
barley.
6 pounds.
But isn't that the barley?
Oh, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
that's
so the wheat's 2 pounds. So by the prices I found before, I'm just gonna give it an average of $3 for 2 pounds. Right now, as it stands in America. Going on Amazon or whatever. The math that we just did, and I agree with the numbers, so hopefully we're right. At $15 an hour for a full day, it's $120. You can go get 2 pounds of wheat for $120.
Better eat it slow.
Yes! This is why we're thinking famine, right? This is exactly why. If it costs this much, that means it's rare. The only reason prices get jacked up is because there's not enough of it to go around. Now barley, what was it, 6 pounds?
Mm-hmm.
For a day's wages, right?
Mhm.
I found out, but I can't remember. But it was less than this, than the wheat, just like it is in here. But again, if it costs you $120 to get 6 pounds of barley, which is inferior to wheat, you understand this is a problem. And then we get to the olive oil and wine, and it's interesting, there's no price on this. What is said about the olive oil and wine?
Don't waste it.
Don't harm it, don't touch it, don't waste it.
My Bible says that on the footnote, yet the luxuries of the wealthy, oil and wine, will remain untouched.
Yeah, that's one of the differences, I think, in interpretations. Actually, olive oil and wine weren't that uncommon, but they weren't necessary. So in a sense, I guess you could say it's a luxury, but it's not like it was only for the 1% could enjoy those things. Olive oil and wine were actually very common products that a lot of people used. And remember the wine that Jesus shared at his, we call it the Lord's Supper, but at the Passover. There was wine at most meals he probably had, and it wasn't the strong stuff, but wine was very, so the difference here is not that these are luxury foo-foo items, it's that you need these to survive. These you can go without. You don't want to. I mean, it's nice to have them. But these, no. One of the things I read, which helped make sense of this to me, these would still be growing, getting ready for harvest when these are already done. So now that this has grown, if you're trying to think of it realistically or concretely, once these are grown and there's too little of it, the prices are really ratcheted up. These, don't touch them, let them grow. Let the olive trees alone. When you're going through the conquest and fighting each other, don't destroy the olive trees. Don't mess up the vines. Keep the olive oil and the wine. Leave it alone. Don't touch it.
Right,
Yeah.
I think, some of the commentary and stuff I was telling you that I read, probably the most popular that I've read is that the wheat is pretty much saying a loaf of bread. The feed for the people. The barley was described as being feed because it's less for the animals.
Yeah.
And like you said, the olive oil and wine, whenever you're paying all that money for a loaf of bread, the wine and the olive oil were only able to be indulged by the wealthy.
Sure, in that case, in famine, you're right.
Right, so it used for, the one's used for an example, it's like Venezuela today, you know, we see it in the news every day. It's a good thing to think about, what they're trying to do with the country here. Venezuela has free healthcare. They have, free education. Let's pay a week's wages for something to eat, for a loaf of bread. How's that working out for them? Do we wanna go there? That's where we're going. Seems, but it's a good comparison, I think, was to, you know, possibly as to what they're saying, you know.
Yeah, famine has been a part of the human story almost from the beginning. You remember reading in Genesis, Abraham had to go to Egypt because of a famine. And that's where he did the little lie with Sarah and
Joseph.
punk. Yeah, and there's when Joseph was a slave and in jail, that's when the Pharaoh got the word about 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. I kind of tracked the famines that I could find throughout the scriptures, and they pop up over and over again in different times. Now think about it. If you start off with a conqueror, and that leads to violence, is it logical to think that when there's that much violence going on, that there would be a famine to result?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. In fact, a lot of the famine descriptions I found in the Old Testament were about the city of Jerusalem or Samaria being besieged, so you're cut off from your supplies. The famine is inside the city because the violence requires that you do what you can to weaken your enemy, right?
Right.
And that means famine. And it said in Samaria, in the Old Testament, I think it was in the book of Kings, a donkey's head as food. Like, that's how desperate you are. A donkey's head as food costs a fortune because there's no food. Now, in 70 AD, when Jerusalem was besieged by Rome, the same thing happened. Horrible famine. When Jerusalem was besieged by Babylon the first time, way back in the Old Testament, the famine was so bad, mothers were eating their children.
Oh my goodness.
And that was the prophet's sign. The prophet told them ahead of time, that's how bad it's going to get. You'll know I'm sending it to punish you for your stubbornness. But then here's what God told them. When Babylon came, he said, if you will leave the city and surrender to Babylon, you'll avoid all of it. If you stubbornly decide to stay in there and won't listen to me, sword, famine, and plague, one of those is going to get you, including eating your own flesh and blood.
Yeah, you think that's horrible, that's impossible, but I read a book years and years ago, one of the few books I've ever read, and it was, I think the name of it was Alive. I'm talking about the plane crash that happened.
Oh, yeah.
The Donner
And, and they ate each other in order to survive. When you get so hungry, you're gonna do whatever you gotta do. You know, people have been known to eat rats and eat other people and to survive. You will do anything.
Yeah.
Whatever
I
you
would
gotta
just think I'd kill myself first and my child could live.
You like to think that when you're not
It's
hungry.
possible the child already died.
That's why I'm thinking,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe from something else, but if it was starvation, I would hope they would have killed themselves and say, you eat me now.
Oh, no.
Because I can't imagine eating my child.
Well, remember, this was a very wicked city, and that's why they were being punished. Now, after the famine, on that note, after the famine, what comes after the famine?
Death.
Yes.
And Hades.
Now, death and Hades, we know, is a very appropriate pair to bring up at this point. We've heard from Jesus already in the Revelation that he holds the keys of death and Hades. It's interesting to me that when the seal is opened and the living creature says, come or go, that death and Hades are actually obeying the heavenly decree. Isn't that interesting? According to Paul, death reigned until the time of Jesus. It reigned from Adam forward. Jesus comes and takes the keys of death and Hades, defeats the one who holds the power of death, who is Satan. So Jesus is shown already in Revelation and in the New Testament to be the conqueror of death. Amen?
Amen.
Come on. So he gets to command death and Hades because he's got the keys. So he commands Death and Hades to go, and they go on this deathly looking horse. But what are their tools of death? What does it say there?
Sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth.
So this is interesting. If you're trying to read this as a playbook for how the future will unfold, this is awful. It's awful however you read it. But what I'm trying to do this whole time is see the connections to the Old Testament prophecies. I'm trying to see the pattern that emerges. How God has always dealt with the world is how he deals with the world. There's nothing new under the sun, right? Sword, famine, plague, and wild beasts of the earth. So I did a search of this in the Old Testament. And guess what I found? Over and over and over again. God chose, especially towards his own people Israel, but not just them, God chose this triad of means to punish them, to break their stubborn, sinful spirits. The sword speaks to attackers, famine speaks to the lack of food, and plague speaks of disease that comes. And as I mentioned before, when the city of Jerusalem was besieged, or Samaria, all of these happened. If you got out of the city, they cut you down. If you stay in the city, then you've got no food. And because everyone is so desperate and things are so bad, there's a plague that goes through the whole city because you've got rotten bodies everywhere. And you've got no running water, you've got no hygiene. People aren't well fed and nourished. So this is the terrible face of human suffering. And God said, if you do not obey me, I will unleash these on you until you start listening. And I could give you the scriptures. I don't want to take the time to read through them all because there's so many. But this exact combination is brought up over and over and over again. I don't think that's coincidental to the Revelation. I don't think that just happened to be what death and Hades were thrown around on earth. This is God's program. This is how he's always done it. Now, also interestingly, in a couple of places in the Old Testament, hooked onto those three, guess what? Wild beasts. That's weird. Now, this just shows that all of the natural, human and natural order are against you. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
Humans are coming after you with swords. Food's failing you. Health is failing you. And even the animals are after you. This is God's way of saying, why are you trying to be my enemy? I control the whole world. Why are you my enemy? If you will turn and obey me, you don't have to deal with any of this. Also interesting, in the time of David, when he was king, he/Israel sinned. It depends on if you're reading Chronicles or Kings. And because he was the king, he had a decision to make. God came to him through an angel and said, you can pick one punishment. You can either be cut down by the sword, you can either have a famine, or you can have a plague. What do you want? What kind of decision is that to make? And there was a different time frame for each one. And so David's calculating what's the least amount of loss. And so he said, we'll put ourselves in God's hands, not in the hands of some human enemies or something. And so he asked for this. And so the plague came through, and God actually stopped it because David acted to seek his mercy. So that was a good move on David's part. But again, this pattern is all the way through the Old Testament. I just don't want you to miss that this is not about how is the end of the world going to go. This is how does God deal with wickedness in his world, especially the wickedness that hurts his people. Remember, this is the whole point. That the scroll is in the hand of the high king because his people are suffering and the wickedness seems to be going unanswered. Nothing's happening to these wicked people. Now that the scroll's in his hand, it's like, well, we'll see how God deals with wicked people. And it's just like he did in the Old Testament. So that's how I understand these four horses. Rather than trying to understand, is this the Antichrist or Jesus coming back or the early church conquering, all this. Let's just understand, from the Old Testament to this revelation at the end of the New Testament, this is God's promise. I know how to deal with wickedness on the earth. And even though it looks like I'm not, even though it looks like my hand is held back and I'm unconcerned about it all, just wait for me. My timing is just right. And when I decide it's time, the earth will deal with my wrath because I am a good judge. Justice will prevail. But that, go ahead.
That's just a good thing to remember when people say, you know, why does God let all this happen to us and why is it He let this go on? I can go back and He is going to deal with it. I can show them right there in His own time, but
Yeah,
He's not going to let it happen, go on without
Just
punishment.
unanswered. Yeah.
Right, that's right.
Now, even after we and the original readers or hearers, even after we hear all this, there's this burning question. But why is it taking so long? So doesn't it make sense that when the fifth seal is broken open, what do we see happening? This exact question is being raised. But how long? You're saying it's going to happen. These 4 seals at least indicate that you've got this in the works. But how long? So look again at the fifth seal with me. This is to me probably this has the most teeth to me, because this has the most clarity about what it's really saying. The other ones we can debate all day long, and people do debate it online, believe me. I read through the debates, some of it. Who are these and when is it all going to happen? That's fine. But to me, the fifth seal is the real meat and potatoes. Because there are real people suffering right now. And I don't think they're worried about who the white horse rider is. I think they're worried about, God, when are you going to deal with this? Right? We have the luxury of just pontificating on what these things mean. Real Christians in the world today that are looking at this is what they want to know. So how long? How long? And so look at the fifth seal with me. Verse 9. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar. Now, which altar is this? He says the altar, like we should know. What altar has he already mentioned?
Where they, at the base of the altar with the blood,
The Lord's altar.
You're getting us there, right? So remember this whole idea that the heavenly setup is the real deal, and the tabernacle / temple are the copy, right?
Right.
yeah.
So whatever you see in the tabernacle or temple, it has the real version in heaven itself. So the altar we've seen thus far, indicated at least, is the altar of incense. Because do you remember that when the 24 and the 4 in heaven were bowing down with harps in their hands to worship the Lamb and the one on the throne, what did they have also? The golden bowl full of incense, right? So that's when we looked at the 2 things.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about the altar here, I think our best way to understand this is the altar of incense. And when you go to chapter 9, we'll see that that's definitely true. I'm sorry, chapter 8. Look at chapter 8, verse 3. Another angel who had a golden censer. We looked at this, I think, last week or the week before. That's that orb-like thing that holds the burning incense to let off the smoke. Another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. And again, you're like, what altar is it? He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all God's people on the golden altar in front of the throne. So just like the altar of incense was in front of the most holy place, God's throne room, in heaven we have this picture of an altar of incense in front of the actual throne of God. So that's the altar I believe we can envision here back in chapter 6. So chapter 6, verse 9 again. I saw under the altar, I'm reading the altar of incense, the souls of those who had been slain for any and every reason? No, this is a particular group of people. They were slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony they, what? Maintained. That's the word, isn't it? When it started to hurt, they kept on with the testimony. When it started to be costly, they kept on with their witness. The Word of God was always the treasure to them. That is going to be the theme of Revelation. Oh, it makes my heart sore. And later we're going to see that they did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. And so they overcame the dragon with the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. Like, nail it, yes! We're going to see it again when we talk about how these are the ones who came out of the Great Tribulation. That's right, because they held on to His word, and even when it hurt, they kept their testimony maintaining it. Yeah.
like the martyrs that we talk about every week.
That's
The
right.
people who gave their life for God.
Yeah.
That's them.
This is them. And this is why I'm wanting to talk about them every week, just so we remember, oh yeah, these are real people. My brother Chang, or my sister Lola, or whatever, that all over the world, these people in all cultures are these exact people. So, what are they doing? Are they worshiping? I mean, they're right in front of the throne. I mean, they are right there in the presence. Presumably, and I don't want to push the vision too hard here, but presumably, if they were there the whole time, they're witnessing everything John is. Though they weren't there, so I don't know. But at least in this moment of the vision, there they are in front of the throne. Let's see, what's on their mind
Revenge.
is connected to this. Right? So, they called out in a loud voice. This is their unanimous cry. All of them together have this yearning. How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth? Remember that phrase, the inhabitants of the earth speaks to the wicked people of earth. And avenge our blood. They are relying on their king to make this right. They weren't going to do it themselves because they listened to Jesus. They trusted him. You do not pursue vengeance yourself. You turn the other cheek. You go the extra mile. You give them more than they've asked you for. When they curse you, what do?
Turn the other cheek.
Which is you bless them, right? If they slap you on the right cheek, turn the other one. Yeah, whatever is good for them, do that. He said, pray for those, not against those. Pray for those who persecute you. So they have trusted Jesus, and they paid the price for it because they didn't fight back, and here they are. Souls in heaven, they're dead, right? So why is it that they were able to trust Jesus when bad and unjust things were going on to let it be? Because Jesus promised them something. Your Father will handle it. Not, it's okay for evil to happen, don't worry about it. That's never been Jesus' policy. His policy is, and I love, we're going to look at this, but I won't be able to have a chance. Go ahead. Well, what were you going to say, Bill?
I just sitting there thinking, it talks about the soul. So there again, they're souls, and I don't know exactly how that works because I've never been there. But the souls. So that's, when Christ comes again, we'll be given our new bodies.
Correct.
So these haven't had their new bodies yet. They're
Right.
still souls. Like when we die now and go to heaven, our soul or our spirit goes to heaven, and we haven't been given a body yet.
Right.
But they have to, but it's apparently recognizable because they're there and they're talking and they're seeing.
Yes.
So our souls apparently have something to it other than just nothing,
Just wisps of air.
As like I said, if you were to take and cut somebody open into 20 million pieces, you're not going to find a soul in there.
That's right.
I mean, it's in there, but you can't see it, what it looks like.
Yeah. So there's indications from what Paul wrote that we have like this temporary spiritual body given us in heaven itself. But for the purposes of this vision, because it's a vision, whatever John saw, it could have been a million things, just because it's not necessarily concretely the way it is in reality. It's just something he could recognize. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a good question. What is it you're seeing if you're seeing a soul? Like a Casper type thing?
One other thing I want to mention, see if you're, and I think you agree, I know you said a little bit, but it talks about, the creatures, the living creatures, the four creatures. And what I've understood that to be is, if you want to put say the word like a chain of command. And I think, you said it here a while ago, those four creatures are held higher than the angels. They're there, they've always been there, they're there, and they seem to be the top dog below Christ, but above angels and above everything else. So, like you say, you take the people and you take the angels and you take like the archangels and work your way up until you get to these creatures who seem to be way above everything else.
Yeah, they seem to be the top of the order.
Yeah. It's almost like a chain of command.
Yeah, you do get that picture of the spiritual realm.
Yeah.
That's right. I wanted to show you the example that Jesus gave us in 1 Peter chapter 2. I have a feeling we're going to look at this a lot, but that's cool with me, because this is the one that is supposed to guide us, according to Peter. What we're seeing here in the fifth seal is this exactly.
Say chapter 2.
Yeah, 1 Peter 2.
1 Peter 2.
1 Peter in general is a great companion to the Revelation because of its treatment of suffering as a Christian. It's one of the greatest treatments of suffering as a Christian that we have in our Bible, and that's why it so beautifully goes along with the message of Revelation. Let's start in verse 18. 1 Peter 2:18. Now he's talking to one of the most vulnerable groups in Roman society, and notice how he advises them, or calls them as an apostle to live. It's different than you would expect in the American culture. Because in the American culture, we call those who are down low to rise up. Listen to what he says. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters. Not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. This would not fly in our culture. You get on TV as Oprah and say this, people are like, what? No, this is not how we Americans operate. If there's something wrong, we stick up for ourselves or stick up for our whatever, right? Duke it out. He says, even if they're harsh, even if they're unfair to you, even if they mistreat you, what does he say? Submit yourselves to them. For it is commendable, get this, if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they're conscious of God. You're not doing it because they're such sweethearts or because you couldn't beat them up if you tried. That's not even the issue. I'm conscious of God. I have this awareness of God's role in my life, right? But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? Okay, so you stole from the master's kitty box and he caught you and he beat you. There's no honor for that, right? This is not good for you. There's no reward for you. But if you suffer for doing good, for being faithful as a slave, for submitting yourself, doing good work, and you endure that suffering, this is commendable before God. To this you were called. Why? Not because you're garbage, not because you're not worth it, which is the constant drumbeat of our culture. It's because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example. You realize your well-being is completely connected to the Christ you follow and your awareness of who God is. And then he says, he left you an example to follow, that you should follow in his steps. Okay, this is the punchline. This is what I wanted to read with you. He committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. So he was innocent. Yet, when they hurled their insults at him, even though he was innocent, they hurled their insults at him. But look at him. Look at Jesus. He didn't retaliate. He had every right to. Don't you believe that if anyone had a right to stand up against injustice, it was Jesus?
Yes.
I mean, come on. No one could call him on anything he had ever done. They had to make up lies just to try to get him. He didn't retaliate. When he suffered, do you see that? He didn't even threaten. I mean, some people will threaten just to look big, even though they don't intend to do anything. Just didn't even try to look big. He just took it. He himself. Oh, I missed the most important line to this whole discussion. Instead of retaliating or threatening, what did Jesus, your master, do?
Left the hands of God.
Justly.
And that's what these souls under the altar had trusted Jesus enough to do. Jesus, you said that if I would endure this with grace and love and humility, that my Father would handle it, that he would judge justly. So when is he going to do it? Right? It's a fair question. I don't think they're challenging God. I don't think they're being obnoxious. I think this is an honest-to-goodness, fair question to ask. Because what this shows is they do trust he's going to do it. Amen?
Amen.
They're not saying, so we're going to do it or not. They're not pulling that. They say, we trust you're going to. How long is this going to take? It's like the angel in Zechariah 1. Angel of Yahweh, how long until you show mercy? I know you're going to. That's who you are. But it's taking so long, right? So, we've already looked at it, but come on. Just let's end it on this beautiful note. God hears their question. He doesn't condemn them for it. He doesn't shame them for it. He says, then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed, just as they had been. So God knows that his people are going to be killed, and he says, I'm waiting for that to happen, not, I'll do whatever it takes to stop it. He said, I'm actually waiting for that to actually make my move. Yeah.
And back to 1 Peter where you started there in 18, I wrote myself a note here a while ago, but it was talking about slaves. Submit yourself to your master. I think we can use slaves as like today's employees working.
Yes, that's
And
our
your
best parallel.
masters is your boss. And this is what it's saying. Do what they tell you to do.
Yeah.
No matter what, because you work for them. This is what work is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And that's God telling us that.
Absolutely.
You know.
And if the slaves could do it, certainly employees can do it. We have way more protections than they did under the law. I hope that encourages you. I mean, that was a pretty brutal couple of seals, but I hope number 5 really encourages you. When you question, depending on how you do it in humility and trust. But when you question sincerely with trust that God's going to do it, I just don't know when or why it's not happening yet. I hope you can picture his same heart towards you as he had towards those in that picture. He comforts you. He reassures you. He dresses you in the white of purity, And please remember, our suffering won't be on the same par as a lot of people's, but we're going to. We're going to suffer loss of some kind for Jesus. It might be at the hands of our family, of our employers, of who knows, right? Social media. I know we're out of time, so I'll just say this quickly. I actually have been doing some recordings, like for books and stuff. And there was one project I was really excited about because it seemed like it would sell well and all that. And I started to look through the script, and I'm not comparing this to my brothers and sisters in the world, just to give you a small example. And I saw that there were a lot of expletives in it. And I didn't think it was based on what I had seen ahead of time. So I actually already have the job. They've already offered me a job. And so I start to look through the whole thing because I'm going to be recording. And I see that beep boop, beep boop, beep boop, beep boop, and my heart sank. This was going to be a good deal, it's going to be great. And so I had to contact the people who were, the rights owners, and I had to let them know, sorry, I like the project, I like the idea of the project, I just can't do it, I'm sorry. So I was going to withdraw. That happened twice so far. The cool thing was on the first project that this happened, the rights holder said, oh, well, we don't want our audience to hear those words either. Please stay on the project and change the words however you want to. But the second one I haven't heard back, but I'm guessing that's not going to happen.
Well, good for you then.
But,
Yeah.
well, thank you. And I didn't say that to boast. I'm just saying,
No.
even in the small things, if we remain faithful to the Lord Jesus, loss is ahead of us. That's just, we got to just know that, And it won't be anything like arrest and brutal beatings and all that, but whatever is ours to lose, let's lose it with a sense of joy. Like, Jesus, you're worth this. You're worth way more than this. So it's a sacrifice on the altar, and he's so pleased by that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The beams, the 4 beams, it describes their face and their eyes all over the wings. Are they tall? Are they short? Do they explain it?
There's no mention of their size or dimensions, no.
I picture them like little.
Oh, you picture them low. I know why, I bet that is. Our cultural pictorial of the cherub is the little baby. And I looked into why that is, and it's strange, but it comes through the Latin and it comes through the pictures of the Renaissance and all that. But if I'm picturing from the Old Testament descriptions into Revelation, I do picture larger, more imposing. But we honestly don't know. Because the details we do get are creepy.
I think I've seen pictures.
Well, if you're looking
And
at
they
an ox
seem,
and a lion, I guess I kind of visualize them as being what they are. You know, an ox is a pretty good size animal,
Mhm.
and a lion is really big.
Yeah. Well, the faces are those. It says
Yeah, but
that
they're
the
just
body is
sitting there,
more
right?
man-human-like.
Aren't they sitting at
They're
the
standing.
throne?
They're standing around the throne,
Oh.
like almost like a bodyguard attendant to their king. Yeah. I can't wait to see them. Even if it's not this exactly, because it's a vision after all. But even if it's not that, just when I pray to the Lord, I don't worship these beings, but I often think, man, they have been with you for so long. The things they have seen and heard, you never know. These beings are amazing. So how much more so our God? Amen.
Amen.
You just hope that you're one that's under the altar.
Yes, amen. I want to be worthy to be in that company.
Ryan, what does it mean the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters were killed just as they had been? What's that mean?
God has in mind, and I don't know if this is a specific number to him or a situational thing. God has in mind a time when the last of his people will have suffered, and he says enough. So, some would think that God has that number already predetermined, and we're at 85 million. We have to get up to
Right.
80, I don't know. I don't tend to go that way in my understanding of God's foreknowledge. I think it's more, there is a point at which, just like in the Old Testament with Israel, he is slow to anger and abounding in love, amen?
Amen.
But he's also lightning quick when anger finally reaches its limit. It's
So-
like go time. So I think he just means,
It's just,
yes.
okay.
When the fullness of the cup, or when the cup has reached its fullness of wrath, then it's going to get poured out. But just wait, it's not there yet.
And when you said we all will endure suffering, like what did you mean by that? A little bit. I
Well,
need you to elaborate.
yeah.
For my.
For instance, in family life,
Mm-hmm.
if we truly stick to the ways of Jesus, we will be an irritation to people. And we will lose out on things. We won't always be welcome into everything that they're doing. They may even cut us out of their life entirely. I've heard of that happening. That's usually not our situation. But see, this is where the difference between being a churchgoer and being a disciple of Jesus is going to make a huge difference. Most people are fine with you as long as you keep it to yourself. That's true in other countries. The reason they're suffering is not because they're Christians, it's because they won't cut it out. Stop sharing this. Stop meeting together. Just keep it to yourself and everything would be fine, So if we're just religious Christian folk, people don't mind that. You're just nice, But it's when we stay true to the ways of Jesus, we become the light of the world, which is an irritant to the darkness. That's always been true. So sometimes that looks like being ostracized, left out. Sometimes people saying mean things to you. Sometimes it's actual physical violence. In my particular story, my family, it was mild, but they would make those snarky comments. They would throw it back in my face if I did something that wasn't just so. Oh, well, that sounds like a real Christian thing to do, huh? I mean, it was just that smugness, And they loved me and they got me birthday presents. Like, it wasn't terrible suffering, but you sensed that you weren't fully with them, that you were on the outside in some way. At work, I'll tell you, I was never invited out with the guys at UPS because they went out to the strip clubs and stuff, and since I belong to Christ, I can't be with you in those things. So I'm Ryan and they're them, It's just on the outside. So I don't mean terrible suffering. I just mean loss, losing out on things that we otherwise might have if we weren't following Jesus.
I think, anyhow, maybe you're wrong, but I think, when it talks about the suffering for Christ,
Sorry.
I think we suffer for Christ in other ways other than being ridiculed by other people. I think following Christ and being obedient to Christ, I find to be very difficult.
Yeah.
And I spend my life struggling to get it right.
The inner war.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. It's the inner war that I fight every day with something, and try to follow the instruction manual.
It's hard being a
Okay, you better believe it is. You look at people, you say, boy, they got life made. I don't think so. Yeah, look inside. It's not so easy.
You're right.
And I think that's a lot of the struggle and the pain and suffering that we go through is not what other people say so much. A lot of countries and things are, because if they talk about it, they'll end up dead. But we're not under that. We can talk about it all day if we want to. And we're not going to jail for it, or we're not going to get killed for it. But it's the inner suffering that we all battle with every day.
Yeah, but we have people in our lives, each person has a different, whether it's your family, a good friend or whatever, that do make you feel uncomfortable. Or you sense it, you sense that they don't want you to talk about Jesus or.
Yeah, there's a part of you they don't accept.
Yes.
Exactly.
I had a neighbor next door, and she was a good friend, we worked together, and she did something to me. And we're not debating whether she's right or I'm right. She did something to me and got mad at me about it, and we didn't talk. We just weren't gonna be friends anymore. And my son said to me, "Mom, go bake her brownies."
Oh, that's on.
Yeah. I asked her son, I said, "Mom, you should go bake her brownies." And I said, "No way! She should bake me a cake this size." I am not baking her brownies. And every time he saw me, he goes, "Did you bake Kathy brownies yet?" I went, "No." I don't want to talk to her. We're just done. Well, it went on for months and months and months. And he would always ask me, "Did you bake the brownies yet?" So he pointed out scripture, and he goes, "That's what Christ would want you to do." So I said, "Fine, I'll do it. Well, I put those brownies in the oven, and I wanted them to fail. I did. And they turned out, I was like, and then I was still defiant, and I would look out the window, and I said, "I'm gonna wait till she's not home, and I'll bring her to her husband," because I liked him. So she left. I thought, "Oh, great." So I got him all ready. I went over there. Well, he kept me a little longer. And darn if I didn't run smack into her coming out of the house, and she's coming in, and she looked at me and she goes, "What do you want?" And I said, "I just made you some brownies." And she started crying. And she and we didn't argue and who said what and what it, and we just, yeah. But
Didn't matter, did it?
So now my son always says to me, "You got a box of brownies in the house?" There are people out here who remember the brownies. Oh, it's a very hard thing to do when you know you're in the right, and you have to be,
Can I entrust myself to my maker? Yeah, the judge is justly.
Humbling,
it is. It is.
and we're supposed to.
Yeah, just like Jesus. One more thought, and then we'll close because we're past time. But when we speak about loss, I just wanted to point this out. Probably one of the hardest times that this will happen to is within the church. When this has happened to me, when you are trying with your full effort to do things Jesus' way, even within the church, you will have people who terribly mistreat you. And you're like, "But wait a minute, we're on the same side, same team." But they don't see the way of Jesus like you do, and they will resent you for what you're doing. They will call you out on things that aren't even true. And my family went through a little of that, nothing too terrible, but to be hurt because of Jesus by your own church family is probably one of the most disheartening. Because you don't have the reasoning that they just don't know what they're doing. Because they kind of do. And they're still learning. So just be aware, however and wherever it comes from, same thing. Whether it's brownies or a prayer or a note or a hug, just keep loving and trust yourself to your maker.
Amen.